What made Generation X so different? Why are they often described as independent, skeptical, emotionally resilient, and surprisingly private? Was it simply the era they grew up in, or did their childhood permanently shape the way they think? Long before smartphones, social media, and constant digital connection, X, Generation X learned to solve problems alone, entertain themselves without screens, and adapt to a rapidly changing world. But beneath that resilience lies a fascinating psychological story that most people never hear. In this video, we'll explore the science behind the Gen X mindset, uncover the childhood experiences that shaped their personality, and reveal why many psychologists believe this generation developed traits that are becoming increasingly rare today. Nu Sipstim. You may even discover that these hidden patterns explain not only generations X, but the generations that followed. You know what's strange? We talk endlessly about boomers and millennials. We dissect Gen Z like there's some kind of fascinating new species. But there's this entire generation that just exists in the middle, barely mentioned, almost invisible. Generation X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980. They're your older coworkers who never complain. Your parents who seem oddly detached sometimes. The people who built the internet but don't post about their breakfast. And here's what nobody tells you. Their psychology is probably the most misunderstood of any living generation. They were the first generation of latchkey kids on a massive scale. Picture this. It's 1978. You're 8 years old and you come home to an empty house because both your parents are working. No smartphone, no Ring cameras, no way for anyone to check if you're okay. You let yourself in, make yourself a snack, do your homework alone, and wait. A study published in the American Journal of Psychiatry found that by 1984, approximately 7 million children between ages 5 and 13 were regularly unsupervised after school. That's an entire generation learning that you can't always count on someone being there. That empty house did more than make them self-reliant. It drilled in the idea that actions have real consequences, ones you can't talk your way out of. When their parents finally showed up, you always knew where you stood. The rules hit hard and fast. Nobody cared about how you felt or wanted to talk about it. Step out of line and you paid for it right then and there. Psychologically, this created what researchers call a high contingency environment, where actions and outcomes were directly linked without buffer time. Your brain learned to predict consequences in real time, which is why Gen X tends to think 3 steps ahead in ways that baffle younger generations. Gen X grew up watching their parents talk a big game about stability, then turn around and rack up divorce rates through the 70s and 80s. They saw people give their all to companies only to get pink slips when the next round of layoffs hit. Everyone told them, work hard, follow the rules, and life will work out. But then the rules just changed right in front of them. So yeah, psychologists might call it defensive pessimism, but Gen X, they just call it being realistic. It's not that they're cynical exactly. It's more like they built up this emotional armor. They cross their fingers for good things, but deep down they expect the rug to get pulled out because honestly, that's what kept happening. And that's a big reason you barely hear them on social media. They grew up in a time when privacy was just normal. When you messed up as a kid, maybe a handful of people knew, and that was that. No phones, no viral videos, just some awkward memories in a basement or a parking lot. The idea of blasting your life out for strangers to see, that doesn't feel exciting to them. It feels risky. It's not about not getting tech. It's about learning early on that the less people know about you, the safer you are. Gen X basically turned irony into a shield. Crack a joke, keep things at arm's length, laugh it off before it stings. You can see exactly where that comes from. They grew up in the shadow of the Cold War when teachers talked about nuclear war like it was just another rainy day. Duck and cover drills in school as if a desk would save anyone, when adults act like everything's about to go up in smoke, but also insist you shouldn't worry. You get used to holding two clashing ideas at once, and you learn to keep a little distance just in case. But here's what's fascinating. Despite all this, Gen X developed a distinctive approach to work that stands out even today. They don't talk about it. They don't post about it. They just do it. This work ethic was forged early through jobs that seem almost archaic now. Paper routes at 5 in the morning, bagging groceries, working fast food registers where you had to calculate change in your head when the machine broke. These weren't resume builders. 6. They were raw introductions to the adult world where a 12-year-old could be responsible for delivering news to an entire neighborhood. They watched their parents' generations get destroyed by corporate restructuring, so they never believed in company loyalty, but they're fiercely loyal to their own competence. They can't control whether they'll get laid off, but they can control whether they're the most valuable person in the room when layoffs happen. There's this weird paradox at the core of Gen X psychology. They're simultaneously the most independent generation and the most quietly collaborative. They'll never ask for help, figure it out themselves. Been doing that since they were 8. But if you need help, they'll show up without drama, without a social media post about it. This comes from forming tight bonds with friends out of necessity, when parents were absent. And let's talk about their relationship with authority, because it's complicated. They respect competence, not titles. If you've earned your position through actual skill, they'll follow you anywhere. If you're just someone with a fancy job title who doesn't know what they're doing, they have zero patience. Gen X questions authority because they watched incompetent authority figures make terrible decisions their entire childhood. From Watergate to Iran-Contra to the fumbled AIDS crisis, they faced serious economic headwinds that their parents' generation hadn't experienced. The youngest, Gen Xers, graduated college right into the dot-com bubble burst. The oldest ones were hitting their stride when the 2008 financial crisis hit. They've been economically traumatized repeatedly, which is why they're more likely to have multiple income streams. Not because they're entrepreneurial by nature, but because they've learned that nothing lasts. Gen X tends to struggle with what some researchers have identified as patterns of self-reliance that border on anxiety. They're incredibly capable at handling crisis situations, but that capability often comes from an unwillingness to depend on others. Research in the Journal of Adult Development shows that Gen Xers report lower levels of seeking social support during stressful periods. Not because they don't have people they could ask, but because asking feels like admitting defeat. This self-reliance extended to how they processed information. Before the internet, knowledge had a different kind of weight. Gen X spent hours in libraries, hunting through card catalog drawers for a single book that might contain the answer they needed. Information had a physical cost. It required effort and time. And because of that, they valued what they learned differently. Cognitive psychologists describe this as deeper encoding, where information that requires effort to obtain becomes more permanently integrated into memory. They learn to fix things with their hands because that's what you did when your bike chain slipped or the TV flickered. You didn't call, a technician. You flipped the bike upside down, got grease thousand on your hands, and figured it out. This built a mechanical intuition, a belief that with enough patience and a screwdriver, you could master the physical world. And now they're watching their kids grow up in a completely different world. One with helicopter parents and constant supervision, and social media documenting everything. They gave their kids the attention they never had. But sometimes they worry they've made them too soft, too dependent, too visible. Because in the Gen X worldview, being visible means being vulnerable. The truth is, Generation X might be the last generation that truly understands what it means to be alone with your thoughts, to be bored, to solve problems without Googling the answer. They're not better than other generations, just different, shaped by a unique moment in history when the old world was dying and the new one hadn't quite been born. They're the bridge generation. And bridges don't get much attention. They're just there, doing the work, holding things together, expecting nothing in return. And maybe that's the most Gen X thing of all, not caring if anyone notices. If this hit home for you, please subscribe. And if you want to support these deep dives, hit that join button to become a channel member. I would genuinely appreciate your hesjes, the psychology of Gen X, the most independent generation ever have. You ever wondered why Generation X seems so different from everyone else? Why they tend to be more independent, more skeptical, and often less interested in constant attention or validation? Why many of them seem comfortable, seeing alone, solving their own problems, and quietly getting on with life? Some people call them the forgotten generation. Others call them the bridge between the analog and digital worlds. But psychology suggests something deeper. Generation X, those born roughly between 1965 and 1980, grew up during a unique period of social change. They witnessed rising divorce rates, economic uncertainty, shifting cultural values, and the birth of the digital age. Many came home from school to empty houses. Many learned to entertain themselves. Many learned a lesson very early in life. If something needs to be done, you better figure it out yourself. And while that lesson created incredible resilience, it also left psychological marks that are still visible today. This is the psychology of Generation X. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this generation became one of the most adaptable, self-reliant, and misunderstood groups in modern history. Let's begin. Imagine being 10 years old, no smartphone, no social media, no GPS, no internet. When school ended, there wasn't a constant stream of notifications waiting for you. There wasn't a device telling you what to watch next. You simply went outside. You explored, you figured things out. Psychologists often talk about something called self-directed learning. This is the ability to solve problems independently without immediate guidance. Selidation, XX, experienced enormous amounts of it. Many spent hours unsupervised. Not because parents didn't care, but because life was different. Two-income households became increasingly common. Divorce rates rose. Parents worked longer hours. As a result, millions of Gen X children became what researchers later called latchkey kids. They came home to empty houses, made their own snacks, finished homework alone, solved small crises without adult intervention. At the time, nobody realized how profoundly this experience would shape an entire generation. Because when children repeatedly handle challenges independently, they develop a strong internal sense of competence. Instead of thinking, someone will help me, they learn to think, I'll figure it out. This mindset became one of the defining characteristics of Generation X, but there was another side to it. Independence often comes with emotional self-reliance, and emotional self-reliance can sometimes turn into emotional isolation. Many Gen X adults became incredibly capable, but they also learned not to expect much support from others. Not because they wanted to be alone, but because they became accustomed to handling things themselves. This created a generation that often appears strong on the outside while quietly carrying burdens alone. Another fascinating psychological trait of Generation X is skepticism. Compared to younger generations, Gen X tends to be less trusting of institutions, advertising, and authority figures. Why? Because they grew up watching major social shifts unfold in real time: economic recessions, corporate scandals, political controversies, changing family structures. The world around them seemed less stable than previous generations had promised. Psychologists call this learned skepticism. When people repeatedly see contradictions between promises and reality, they become cautious about accepting claims at face value. This doesn't necessarily make them cynical. It makes them careful. They tend to question before believing, viscerd, verd before trustings, observe before committing. This is why many Gen X individuals can appear reserved at first. They're often assessing situations before fully engaging. In a world increasingly driven by instant opinions and emotional reactions, this trait can seem unusual, but for Generations X, skepticism became a survival skill. They learned early that appearances can be misleading and that independence requires critical thinking. Another characteristic often associated with Generation X is adaptability. To understand this, we need to look at the timing of their lives. Gen X grew up in an analog world, but entered adulthood during the digital revolution. Think about what that means. Asts. They learned life without computers, then learned computers. They learned life without the internet, then adapted to the internet. They learned life before smartphones, then adapted to smartphones. Most generations experience gradual change. Generation X experienced transformation. And psychology tells us that repeated adaptation strengthens cognitive flexibility. Cognitive flexibility is the ability to adjust thinking when circumstances change. People with high cognitive flexibility tend to handle uncertainty better. They're less likely to panic when plans fall apart. They're more capable of finding alternative solutions, and they're often more resilient during major life transitions. Generation X spent decades practicing this skill. As a result, many developed a practical mindset instead of asking, why is this happening? They often ask, what do I do next? That difference is psychologically powerful because resilience isn't the absence of difficulty. It's the ability to move forward despite difficulty. And Generation X became experts at it. But resilience has a hidden cost. Psychologists have discovered that highly self-reliant individuals often struggle to ask for help. When you've spent years solving problems independently, vulnerability can feel uncomfortable. Many Gen X adults grew up hearing messages like, "Toughen up, deal with it, don't complain." These attitudes encourage strength, but they sometimes discouraged emotional expression. As a result, many members of Generation X became skilled at managing emotions privately. They often process pain internally, handle stress quietly, and avoid burdening others with their problems. While this can create impressive emotional control, it can also create loneliness. Because strength and connection are not the same thing. A person can appear strong while still needing support. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Generation X is their relationship with attention. Unlike younger generations who grew up in an era of constant visibility, Gen X often developed identities away from public observation. There were no likes, no followers, no personal brands, no pressure to document every moment. Psychologists know that environments shape behavior. And when people grow up without constant external feedback, they often develop stronger internal validation systems. In simple terms, they become less dependent on approval from others. This doesn't mean they don't care what people think. Everyone cares to some extent. But Gen X tends to place less emphasis on public recognition. Many are comfortable succeeding quietly, working behind the scenes, keeping achievements private. This trait can sometimes be mistaken for indifference. But in reality, self-sufficiency, it often reflects self-sufficiency. Their sense of worth is less tied to visibility and more tied to competence. Another interesting trait is humor. Generation X is famous for sarcasm, but psychology suggests sarcasm is more than just entertainment. Research has linked certain forms of humor to cognitive complexity. Humor allows people to process difficult realities while reducing emotional distress. For Generation X, sarcasm often became a coping mechanism. Economic uncertainty? Make a joke. Life disappointment? Make a joke. Stress? Make a joke. Humor became a psychological pressure valve, a way to acknowledge reality without being overwhelmed by it. This explains why many Gen X individuals can joke about situations that others find serious. It's not because they don't care. It's because humor became one of their primary coping tools. Let's talk about relationships. Generation X often values loyalty over performance. In other words, they care less about appearances and more about consistency in seven sasses. Why? Because many grew up during periods of instability, and instability teaches people to appreciate reliability. Psychologically, humans seek security. When early environments feel unpredictable, dependable relationships become especially valuable. This is one reason many Gen X adults place enormous importance on trust. Trust isn't automatically given. It's earned, and once earned, it often becomes incredibly important. This creates deep friendships, long-term loyalty, and strong commitments, but it can also make betrayal particularly painful, because trust represents more than confidence. It represents safety. Another major characteristic of Generation X is pragmatism. They often focus on what works rather than what sounds ideal. This trait developed because many witnessed the gap between theory and reality. Psychologists call this experiential learning. People learn through direct experience, and repeated experience teaches practical thinking. Generation X learned that life is rarely perfect. Plans fail, mistakes happen, unexpected challenges appear. So they developed a mindset centered around adaptation rather than perfection. This practical outlook often helps them navigate crises effectively. While others panic, they focus on solutions. While others debate possibilities, they take action. This isn't because they're fearless. It's because experience taught them that progress matters more than perfection. However, perhaps the most important psychological lesson of Generation X is balance. They stand between two worlds, old and new, analog and digital, traditional and modern. They remember life before constant connection, and they understand life after it. This unique position gives them a perspective that few generations they understand independence, possessed, independence, but also recognize the value of technology. They appreciate privacy, but can adapt to transparency. They value resilience, resilience, but increasingly recognize the importance of emotional health. In many ways, Generation X became translators between eras. They carry lessons from the past while navigating the realities of the present. And maybe that's why they are often overlooked, because they don't demand attention. They don't always dominate headlines. They rarely make themselves the center of the story. But beneath that quiet exterior lies a generation shaped by extraordinary change. A generation that learned to adapt, to endure, to question, to survive, and perhaps, most importantly, to keep moving forward. The psychology of Generation X isn't really about age. It's about what happens when people grow up with freedom, uncertainty, responsibility, and change all at once. Those experiences created resilience. But they also created complexity. Strength mixed with caution. Independence mixed with loneliness. Confidence mixed with skepticism. And understanding those contradictions may be the key to understanding Generation X itself. Because behind every generation is a psychological story. And the story of Generation X is one of adaptations, not because they chose change, but because change chose them. And somehow, through it all, they learned how to thrive. If you enjoyed this exploration into the psychology of Generation X, let us know in this sense. Which Gen X trait do you relate to the most? Independence, skepticism, resilience, adaptability, or loyalty? And if you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more deep dives into human psychology. Until next time, stay curious.